Good morning, church. It's good to see each of you. See several visitors with us today, and we're thankful for you being able to be here with us, and we hope that you will feel welcomed, and we hope that you will, it's an honor. I say this sometimes at funerals, but I still think it's probably true and unique of most church settings too, is that, when a group like this comes together, frequently, this may be the only time ever that this exact group is together. And so we're thankful that today is a unique day, just because it's a day that this group of people came together in this place to worship a God who is worthy of being honored in so many ways. I would like, we don't do this regularly. If you're a visitor here, understand we don't do this all the time. So this is introverts' worst nightmare when they hear me say we don't do this all the time. Because I want us to take just a minute together. Let's stand and let's greet those around us. Let's tell them good morning, tell them that God loves them, and tell them that you love them. All right, thank you very much. We are thankful for that time we get to spend just a little bit. And I know, people and having to talk to people, sometimes people you don't know can kind of zap energy of some people. For some people, it sets them up so they can go the rest of the day. And we recognize that people are wired different. But one of the things that you need to know is that we are social people. And even if you're not wired to want to talk to people, it's good that you keep human connections. So keep that in your mind as we go forward. Which really kind of leads us into what we're going to talk about today as we continue in this series. Originally was going to be 4 parts, and it's turned into 8. And so we're in the 4th part today. But as I've studied, and I'm going to stop at 8. I've got an outline. It's not going to go past that. But there's so much here where God is using images and sounds. And last week we talked about the Passover and how God would use all of the senses to connect with people in a meaningful way. And we even talked about how our worship does that. Even the power of touching those and the power of taste as we share a meal together to remember the sacrifice of Jesus. And in many ways, those who don't know the Jesus story, and maybe they're not religious at all, that seems odd. These things seem a little odd, but to us, they bring us to remember the things that maybe we might tend to forget and help us centralize on the most important things. There are times where it is hard to forget a thing. There are times where when you think about how kind of like your life has went, there are moments in time where you are very present and you are emotionally full in those moments. It was mentioned last week. We're not going to be here next week. I'm going to be visiting a mouse in Orlando, an expensive mouse, by the way. And one of the things that Disney does so incredibly well, though, is they captivate your senses, all your senses. And when you're there, it's like you're just inundated with being able to be present in that moment. I used to tell people, especially when I was in youth ministry. Youth ministry, by the way, is much more stressful than preaching ministry. It's half the stress and it's twice the stress and half the money. I don't know why people do it. But it was the one place I could go, and in that moment, I didn't think about anything outside of those walls. I was just present, and I was there, and there was so much to take in. This morning, we're going to talk about the opposite of that. What is it when there's nothing when it is just empty and void. The Bible talks about this place as the wilderness. And we recognize wildernesses, and we use that term in more than one way. We don't just talk about the physical place of a wilderness. As a matter of fact, I think there are a lot of people, and by the way, sometimes wilderness in the Bible and desert, those are the same Hebrew words, so think desert. So I imagine if I asked for a show of hands, how many of you have never visited the desert? I'm one of those people. Several of you have never visited the desert. But if I asked you, have you been through a wilderness? Oh, yeah, I've been through a wilderness, haven't I? And what do we mean by that as humans? We mean a place that was so disoriented and so broken that I just couldn't see. I couldn't hear. I couldn't, things hadn't, I'll hear this when people talk about like traumatic moments in their life. Things had no taste. Things just didn't matter in that moment. It was just a feeling of just empty brokenness. So if I ask the question, how many of you have been through a wilderness in that context, I imagine every hand goes up. And if every hand doesn't go up, be patient, because it will. There'll be moments in your life where you're going to go through and experience some real difficult stuff. You're going to hit some wildernesses where in those moments you're so disoriented, you don't know, and you doubt your faith. You doubt God. You doubt the people around you. You even sometimes doubt reality. Is this even real? You're so disoriented. You have been through a wilderness, or you will go through a wilderness. And God knew that you were going to go through a wilderness, that you were going to go through places and times where you were disoriented from your senses, where you couldn't see God easily, where you couldn't hear God easily, where you couldn't grasp the very concept of God easily. As a matter of fact, if we went and took a poll around the neighborhood of how many people and said that did not believe in God, and you ask what is the number one problem, and really the number one thing when we talk about people and God and maybe disbelieving in God is we struggle with kind of reconciling a loving God and all the hurt and the pain and the suffering that happens in our world. And what we're saying in a roundabout sense is, if there is a God, why is there so much wilderness? If there is this loving God, why is there so many places and times that I can't feel that and know that and sense that in my very being? The Bible doesn't leave us without answers about that thing, though. As a matter of fact, it starts to answer that question in the very, very beginning. The idea and the concept of wilderness is found in the second verse of our Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. The Hebrew there is tohu vavohu. It's aram, and some have translated that as wild and waste, to try to kind of capture that concept that this is being poetic. And it's talking about that when in the formation of the earth, when God sees it, it's a desert. There's no creation to it. It's just meaningless and void. That God has not touched it yet. And you may say, well, and this is one of the complicated things of, well, how did that get there, right? Genesis 1, like we start seeing this creation of stuff, and I mean, next few verses we're going to see this stuff, but here we have something. I don't know what it is, and that's complex. It's not what we're trying to, but it's not where we're trying to go today, but it's meaningful. And he would go on and say, that the waters, and he would talk about these chaos waters that the Bible talks about. He do these other things, but the very first thing he says is the earth was desert in a roundabout way. It was wilderness. God had not put order into the disorder yet. And he would, though, right? He would go on and he would create, and the concept of Genesis 1 is it shows that God touches things, and when God touches things, disorder and disorganization and maybe even the disorganization of thinking that can happen when you're in a wilderness, it paints a very different picture. It's God saying there's purpose and there's stuff that all works together, and God is in those purposes and in those forms. He is fixing the formless and empty problem. And he would go on in the Genesis story. But man would mess that up, wouldn't they? The idea was that man would be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. The garden was part of a land of Eden, and the garden was God's ideal. It was God's temple, as we've looked in some other places. And the idea that God wanted was to walk with man, and that man and God would be co-creators, and we would spread Eden to all the earth. But man messed that up. And so what we're left with at the end of the Genesis story is we both have creation, we have stuff that's organized and put together, but we also still have wilderness. We still have places that disorient us. We still have a sin problem that leads us to what I call, and we'll look at in just a minute, decreation. It's the opposite of going and being fruitful and multiplying. It's the opposite of having life and having it to the full. It's the opposite of knowing and being in this beautiful union with Jesus, where we know, and those spiritual highs where we've had the hope you have had, where you really are just connected with God. But they're the opposite of that. The Bible tells many creation stories. Genesis 1 is not the only time it talks about creation, but also there are a few pictures in the Bible where there are decreation stories. One of those is happening in Jeremiah, where Jeremiah is prophesying about the rebellion that God's people are going through, the sin problem that they're going through. It says, "Alas, sovereign people, sovereign Lord, how completely you have deceived this people in Jerusalem by saying you will have peace when the sword is at their throats." You see, we have a God who has offered peace, and this natural question that comes, it's that same question I posed just a minute ago. If God, you are offering peace, why does it feel that there is a sword at our throat? Not just a figurative sword, by the way. In many instances, physical swords are at their throats. At this time, the people of Jerusalem will be told, and this is God's response. He says, "A scorching wind from the barren heights in the desert, the wilderness, blows towards my people." There's going to be a wind that comes from the wild and the waste, a wind that comes from the desert. And it's going to blow towards my people, but it's not to winnow or cleanse. It's not to purify. There was this concept that sometimes wind purifies. And sometimes that happens, doesn't it? Wind can play a good role if it purifies and cleans things, you know? And it says that's not the point of this. This would be a wind that is too strong. A wind too strong for that comes from me. Now I pronounce my judgments against them. What I'm saying is that there's going to be wilderness on their horizon because they have forsaken me and they've left me. And he says, look, he advances like the clouds. His chariots come like a whirlwind. His horses are swifter than eagles. Woe to us. He says, we are ruined. And what God is saying is there comes a time and a place in which these people have chosen their own path. They've chosen the wilderness, and God in judgment is going to give them what they chose. They chose to be in the place where God no longer was, or at least was no longer evident. I don't think God completely leaves Israel, but there's certainly times in Israel's history where it's tough for them to see where God is. The same way it may have been times in your life that you it's been tough for you to see where God is. And sometimes it may have been because of your own poor choices. Sometimes it may have been because of the poor choices of others around you. And he's saying, listen, you're going to get a desert wind, and it's going to bring judgment. And notice what, this is just a few verses later, same chapter in Jeremiah. Look what he says. I looked at the earth, It's this picture of this desert wind coming, and there's going to be judgment. Now Jeremiah is saying, this is what I see, prophetically see, once that desert wind comes. And it was the only other place in the Bible where tohu vavohu shows up, is right here. Genesis 1:2 shows up again. It says, I looked at the earth, and it was formless and empty. And I looked at the heavens, and their light was gone. You see, I looked at the mountains, and they were quaking. The hills were swaying. I looked, and there were no people. Every bird in the sky had flown away. I looked, and the fruitful land was now wilderness. It was desert. All the towns were in ruins before the Lord, before his fierce anger. I mean, I hope that you saw what Jeremiah is doing there. He's making a play on Genesis 1, where the Bible says there was formless and void, and there was chaos waters, and there was darkness. And he says, listen, all of the order that God set in place, I see a vision of the future of Israel. And it's the exact opposite. It's going the negative, the exact precise opposite. Now things are again wilderness. They're formless. They're empty. Things are now a desert again. People are no longer going to see God. Let's see, here we go. Let's go to the next slide here. So the wilderness becomes this huge portion of the Bible. It's going to play out in the story of God's people in what we call the Exodus story. In the big story of the Bible, okay, we started in Genesis. We looked at the prophets. In between that, we have a story that takes place of a group of people, ultimately through the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who are seeking to become God's people and to become in harmony and to fill the earth with God's goodness. They're trying to recapture the Eden story. They're trying to bring life again. But the story does not go as we wish it would go because they fail. As a matter of fact, God, in that story, if you were here last week, we talked about this Passover. After the Passover, the people are out into the wilderness. And the community is moving towards what God has promised them. He sets out, and they set out, and they're in this, it calls it the desert of sin, this region. That's the name of the region. It's an interesting choice of words, I might say. And in the desert of sin, they're traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded them. God has just shown them this mighty thing. They were able to see God's goodness in the Passover. They were able to see the sea collapse on their enemies. They were able to smell those smells as God was going to protect them and guide them out of it. They were able to taste those things. They were able to paint that blood on their doorways to get God's protection over their homes. They got all of this stuff, all of the senses, and now they're in a place where they can't see any of that anymore easily. Right? Like they don't have, they don't see, all that's kind of in the rear view. They're memories. And so they're camping here. They're camping at a place called Rephidim, and there's no water for the people to drink. And so they start grumbling and complaining, and they start saying things like, maybe we should be back where we once were. Even though we were slaves, we had food and we had water, but here we're out here and we can't see. There's no food or water for as far as I can see. Where will it come from? And God is crying out to these people saying, trust me, trust me, trust me. But they've forgotten what God has done in their past now that they're in the middle of the wilderness. And he says, and he called the place Massah and Meribah, and those words mean testing and quarreling. That's what they mean. It says, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord. And look what they say. This is, listen to this. They're in the wilderness. God has done all of these mighty works. He has brought them through on dry land. And here's their question. Is the Lord among us or not? said, we're in a place that hurts, where stuff hurts, where we can't see where our next meal is coming from, where we can't see where the next drop of water is coming from, where we can't see the deliverance any longer. And they said, we're not even sure if God is here any longer. If you go through moments in your life where you ask questions about pain and suffering and a good God, and I hope you go through those questions. In many ways, I don't know if you can have a real faith until you go through some of those hard questions in your life. I mean, not saying your faith is not real, but I would just say it's not a tested faith in many ways until you have to ask really hard questions about your faith. And there will be times in your life, I believe, that you're going to come to this point. I know I have. I know some of your stories. I've seen some of you in some of your wildernesses. I've seen you struggle with the question, is the Lord really even here anymore? Is the Lord among us or not? It would go on in that, and they would just continue to groan and to complain, and God would come to Moses, and Moses would provide water. He would speak to a rock. God would tell him, I would hit the rock, and they would hit the rock, and God provided for them in that place and in that time and in that moment. There's another story we'll get to in just a minute where they didn't do that when they were in the wilderness, where things turned another way. But the people, and here's what would happen, by the way. They would go off, and Moses is going to go, and he's going to go up on top of a mountain. He's going to receive maybe if you're new to the Bible, or maybe you're new, you probably heard the 10 Commandments. He's going to go up and receive the commandments. While he's up there, Moses is up there, the people of God are going to turn to other gods to try to fill, because they're in a place where they can't see their God. And so they're like, just show us something. And when they don't think that they see God, they just start creating their own little gods. Let's throw rocks at the Israelites, but we've all done it ourselves. We've all created our own little gods. We've all created our own little things where we find security and safety, where we should have leaned into God and we leaned into something else. We've all been there and we've all done it. And so here's what I really want you to kind of connect with about the concept of wilderness through the Bible. Wilderness stories are symbols in the Bible of what it's like when the God of the senses is not easily visible. What do you do when God is not apparent? It's easy to praise God at times when things are well, when there is no hurt and pain. But what do you do when God is hard to see? And in the Bible, it paints a picture of people as Jeremiah paints and all these, and the Israelites paint. What I call it's an anti-creation story. It's an anti-Eden story. It's the opposite of what God said when He commissions man to be co-creators with Him. They become destroyers of God's good creation. They go back to wild and waste. They go back to formless and void. They go back to the wilderness. And when you see the wilderness stories in the Bible, so here's what happens most of the time in wilderness stories. People really mess up big. They mess up big. And I would say that that's still true today. When we're faced with those moments that we get disoriented, we too struggle and we get disoriented and we can't see God, and we, instead of remembering, which is what why God give them this image of the Passover? Why does God give us this image that we take every week? Well, it's to remember, to remind ourselves, to not lose sight, especially when it's hard to see, especially when it's hard to be present and to see God's presence. And so let me give you a piece of advice. When you go through really tough stuff in your life, there will be a temptation that you will face to pull away from God, and specifically to pull away from gathering in places like this with God's people. there will be a temptation in the middle of the hurt to move away from God. Can I just encourage you to make a decision in your life that when life gets hard, even when you don't feel it, even when you don't feel like you're getting anything out of it, show up anyway. Because it's when we can't see God that we need these reminders even more than ever. We need the reminder of the people that surround us. We need the reminder of this meal that we share each week. We need the reminder of God's words to our life. You need those things. And so let me encourage you that if you're going through storms, if you're online, you're watching, you're going through storms, get inside a church building with people that can surround you and can build you up. The best place for someone who's having doubts about God to be is not outside of these walls asking difficult questions. It's inside these walls asking difficult questions. And those of us who sit inside these walls need to be prepared to answer those difficult questions and to sit with people through those difficult questions to make sure their story does not become an anti-creation story, a destruction story. Because you've all seen people who have destroyed themselves that became anti-creation stories, anti-Eden stories. You've all seen that. Don't let yourself become that when you find yourself in a wilderness. Moses passes the test in this. He remains faithful to God, but time passes, and we pick up another story with Moses, a very similar story in Numbers chapter 20. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place?" They just, look what they just said. They said, "God, we were imprisoned and we were not a people. We had no identity. We were slaves. God, why did you bring us to this wilderness?" They said the wilderness is even worse. That's what they just said. The wilderness is worse. Feeling pain was better than feeling nothing. He said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt? There's no grains, there's no figs, there's no grapevines, there's no pomegranates. All this stuff that you promised, God, when you said you were going to bring us to a promised land, there was going to be good stuff there." He says, "There's none of that stuff. There's not even water that we can drink." They're disoriented. They can't see God. And this time God commands Moses something different. He tells him to speak to a rock. And maybe you're familiar with the story, but if you didn't grow up in church, you may not be. That's just fine. But Moses is commanded to speak to a rock. And out of his great frustration, he too takes a staff and he strikes the rock instead of speaking to the rock. He too chooses to do things his own way. There's a lot of imagery there and a lot of symbolism there, and we can't even get into all of it today. But he chooses decreation in so many ways there. He chooses not to trust in God. He says, "I hit it last time and it worked. I'm going to hit it this time no matter what God says." But God had given him a different command. God said, "Listen, speak to the rock." And he hits it out of his frustration. And in that moment, it becomes a decreation story. The very man who led his people out, Moses, who led his people out of the promised land, is not out of the slavery land, is not going to get to enter into the promised land because he proved something to us, that even God's mighty servant, his mighty leader, the best of the best, the cream of the crop. If you think you were better than Moses, you need to come up and preach this morning, okay? Moses was just a beacon of hope for God and his people, and he failed. Man failed over and over and over. And then we get this weird story. It happens at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and Jesus is compelled to go out into a wilderness. It's really a weird story. It says he went out for 40 days and 40 nights. The people of Israel went into the wilderness 40 years. 40 is sometimes definitely a symbolic number. It means for a complete time. Just think of this as like a complete time. It may or may not have been a literal 40 days. We don't really know. But 40 is definitely a symbol. but let's just say it's a literal symbol days, and Jesus has not eaten or drank in this moment. He's being tested in the wilderness. It's not just a random story, church, okay? It's not just that God said, well, maybe we just need to throw in a wilderness story here, you know? No, he's connecting Jesus to these other stories. You see, the people of God went into the wilderness and they almost failed immediately. Moses went into the wilderness and he failed eventually too. And now Jesus is at his weakest. He's 40 days without food, 40 days without water. I have to think that Jesus may be having hallucinations at this moment, not at this moment, but just if you're out in the middle of the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, you just think about what that will do to you and to your psyche and the way you think about things. He is disoriented. If there was a time and a place where somebody had the right to say, God, where are you? If there was a time and a place, Jesus is free of sin, church. He hasn't deserved this moment, right? Sometimes we think, about the cross and the suffering, but Jesus suffered well long before the cross in many other ways. And so he's taken out in this wilderness, and then all of a sudden, when he's at his weakest, he's probably struggling to live in the presence of God. It's a real moment of hurt and struggle, and that whole thing Paul mentioned about the, not wanting. He doesn't want to be here. Maybe I should credit Lila. I don't want to be here. And yet, here he is. And Satan comes to him and he tempts him with multiple things. He first says, hey, throw the stone on the ground. Make it some bread. Eat. You can fix your problems. Just trust in this process. Here's a stone, throw it on the ground. It'll turn into some bread and you can be full again. He's given a temptation very similar, by the way, to the temptation that Moses was given, wasn't it? It's like, fix this problem. Here's your answer. Fix the problem. When Moses strikes that rock. It's very similar. And here's Jesus' answer. He said, man shall not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. He hearkens himself back to Scripture, by the way. He remembers in the wilderness when all the senses are taken and seeing an absence of God, and you can't see God. It's not a picture of God. No preacher says, all right, let's all imagine God today. Here's a desert, right? No, we say, here's the garden. Let's think about God. It's the opposite of this. And so Satan tempts him other ways. He says, why don't you go up on a high peak, right? This is the third one. He tempts him multiple ways, and he answers every time with Scripture. He says, don't put the Lord your God to the test. And Satan says, well, just worship me, just follow me, trust me. And, he says, just trust me. He says, away from me, Satan, for it's written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. What's Jesus doing? He is doing, and it's not by accident, he's doing exactly what he wanted his people to do in the wilderness. He wanted them to look at when things were bleak and dark and they couldn't sense God. He wanted them to trust in him. And over, Jesus passes a test that both the Israelite people and even the Israelites' leader, God's chosen vessel, Moses, had failed. So when you get to this little random story in the New Testament, you're like, why is this happening? It's because the wild and the waste. It's because of what happened in the very beginning, that there was disorder and there was chaos. There's places where God is not evident, God is not visible. And what will you do when God is not visible and evident? So God's people fall almost immediately in the wilderness. God's chosen leader eventually falls in the wilderness. Jesus conquered what no one else before him could conquer. And so it brings a question to us. What do we do when we're in wilderness and our faith is all we have? When God is not evident, what will we do? What will we choose to do when so many around us may choose to quit? When they may choose to walk away from God, to turn their back on God? What will we do? And so we have a couple of options. We can choose to be the presence of God in those environments. Or we can choose to live in decreation, to live in anti-Eden, to live over here in this place that will not lead to life to the full. Right? He says, as people, as ambassadors of Jesus, as people who bring the message of Jesus, it is a part of our mission to go into environments where God is not visible and not able to be seen and not able to be grasped, and become Jesus in the middle of those environments. To become the hands and the feet of Jesus when it's tough to be hands and feet in the wilderness. And while we are called to do that, there is also this harsh reality that we remind ourselves of, that we remember, and that's this: humans versus the wilderness is always a losing proposition. In other words, while we may choose to be Jesus at moments in wilderness places, we've all had times where we were not Jesus in the wilderness. We've all had times where we became the Israelites, and people looked at us and said, "Oh, there's that guy that tests God. There's that guy that doubts. There's that guy that complains." We've all had moments where in our frustration we, like Moses, rebel and do the thing opposite of what God called us to do. We've all had moments. God spends a large chunk of the Bible just proving to us over and over and over that if man could conquer the wilderness, he would have done it. But man by himself was not ever able and will never be able to conquer the wilderness. That's why when you hear me say this, it's so important. You all know where I stand on many things about mental health care and things like that. I want you to go get them, and I want you to soak in everything you can that can help you be a more wholesome thinker and a better thinker, and to work on the things that maybe you're struggling with. But let me just tell you, you can go read every self-help book that this world has to offer, every one of them. And you're never going to reach perfection. You're never going to figure it all out. It's never going to be all right. It's never going to get where it needs to be. And so while I encourage you to go and find that help when you need help, and find those resources, and especially when you see godly principles built into them, live into them. But don't ever forget, church, that you need God. You may need therapy and you may need God, but you may need both, and that's perfectly fine. But the one thing you can't live without is God. And so when you go into your wilderness, you need to recognize that if you go into wildernesses without God by your side, without the Spirit that God put in you to go into the wildernesses so that you can be the opposite, so that you can be a success story, if you go into those without God, you will inevitably fail. Corinthians is talking about this. 2 Corinthians. From now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. We once regarded Christ in this way. We once saw Jesus as human, is what it's saying. We saw Jesus as humanity. But he says we do so no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has arrived. The old has gone, the new is here. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Jesus, and now he gave us the ministry of reconciliation. So my favorite passages in the Bible right here. The fact is, God saved you, and now you have a ministry because God brought you out of the wilderness. You've got a ministry to those that are still in the wilderness. You are now living as new creations, saved from the wilderness, saved from the impact of the wilderness, no longer having to live without God. And he said, so now you have a ministry and you have a push, you have a hope to push you out into the world to become these little walking, talking Jesuses to the world. And you're not going to win every time. You're not going to pass every time. You're not going to be Jesus. But if the Spirit is living in you, you can go into wildernesses that you could never have went into without Him. And you can be a beacon of creation. You can be new creation. That's what He says, new creation. And He's not just talking about you being different, but he's saying, listen, you are now called to fulfill what God has made for man, that you would be new creation, that you would go and you would take the little garden story where God and man walk together and you start sharing that with other people. That's the hope of Christianity. So Paul would continue. He said, God was reconciling the world to Himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. He's saying, listen, everybody's been to the wilderness. Everybody has fallen in the desert of sin. Everybody has a story. Everybody has a background. But the hope of Jesus is that we now can connect ourselves to the man who conquered the wilderness, who knew what it was like to sit in the moments where God was not visible, where God could not be seen or heard, and yet He still leaned into God. And He said, you didn't do that every time, but now there's hope for you. He says there's hope because God's not going to count that against you if you link yourself to Jesus. If you become a creation story, you no longer have to be a decreation story. He says He has committed to us the message of reconciliation. And so now we're ambassadors. We're these little go-aheads that are bringing this message to the world, and God is making His appeal through us. And so we implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. Let me go Daniel on this. We implore you on Christ's behalf, get out of the wilderness. Connect yourself with the God who can conquer the wilderness. Why, Paul? He said, because God made Him who had no sin, who put Him in the wilderness as perfection and put Him on a cross as perfection to go through wilderness. Because man failed over and over and over again, we have a God who brought about change, and He brought Him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in Him we might become the righteousness of God. In Him, there's now life. In Him, there's new creation. And so where humanity versus the wilderness is failure, do you remember what Paul said? We once just looked at Jesus as just human, but now we don't see Him that way anymore. And he said, and now not only do we not see other people that way, you're no longer just human. It says you are new creation. And here's the hope of the world is simply this, that when new creation faces the wilderness, when God's will and God's presence spreads into the dark places, that's the victory. That's the victory call that our Bible ends with. It's the very images at the end of our Bible are of a new Eden, of a garden city where God takes the failure and He reconciles it and makes it right, and He makes a new creation. No longer will we have to even see the wilderness, much less live in it. See what makes the hope of Jesus so important for our lives. The reason you can't just depend on yourself, the reason you can't just lean into your own being is because you will end up just further into the wilderness on your own devices. But when God is your help, when God is your strength, when God is the protector, and when you remember back to the Passover story and you remember the blood, the protection of God protecting you. And for you, you may not remember that because you may not be connected to that story in the same way the Jews were, but you remember back, God brought you out of some valleys in your life, didn't He? God brought you out of some bad spots. God showed you there was a way out of the wilderness in your life. And now you live not without memories. You've got them. Not without thought, but with blessed hope that we have a God who's going to make all things new. And He's doing it through you. So today, if you're a new creation, you're no longer. Let me challenge you, church. You talking about images? You want to change your mind about how you think about people? You want to change it? When you walk out of this door today and you look at people, don't just say, "Oh, there's a person." Paul said, "We used to see Jesus that way, but we don't do it any longer." No, when you walk out, think, that's a child of a holy God. He is flesh and human, but He is spiritual. And you are eternal if you're a new creation. So you want to go out into this world? Hear me. Start looking. It's a new creation. And you'll also say, man, that person's in the wilderness. He needs the new creation. Start seeing people as more than just human. They're eternal. They have the hope of eternity if they connect to the God that reconciles all things through Jesus, if they can connect to the man who conquered the wilderness. Let it be a mission of reconciliation, that I will leave here today and I will in this place see people who are new creation, and then I'm going to walk out this door and I'm going to see some people who are not, and I'm going to tell them there's a better way to live than the way you're living right now. There's hope beyond the deconstruction. There's hope beyond the life that you have right now that is spiraling out of control, and you're wondering why, and you're wondering where God is. And it very well may be that where you're out here trying to ask the questions, where is God? God is putting you in that position because He wants you to recognize that the way you did things were a failure, and they weren't working, and they weren't happening. Life was broken. And He might be putting you at the bottom of the pit. He might be putting you in the wilderness so you can recognize that you need Jesus and you need to be new creation in Him. If you're not new creation today, go wash away that old self. Rise up in new creation to be filled with the Spirit, to face the world in a new way. Let's baptize you into Jesus today. Let's put that old person away. Let's walk out of here a different person, because you can leave here looking at people one way and looking at yourself one way. Or you can arrive looking at yourself one way and you can leave totally different, full of hope, ready for the new creation when God makes everything new, living into the hope. There's hope for us, church, and there's hope for you if you need Jesus. If you have spiritual need, come while we'll sing together.